transformed into a corporate charter, adding to it the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, a document of incorporation that only applies to employees of this new corporate government.
The Constitution Act of Canada, 1982, Article 32. This charter only applies to the Parliament and Government of Canada in respect of all matters. I made a mistake there. This charter applies. There's no indication of only. There are some who like to add the word only here to say that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is a corporate documentation or corporate power that has nothing to do with free men, free women, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. So when they come to this verse, they read it like this. This charter applies only to the Parliament and Government of Canada. However, as you see, there's no word only here. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 2, Subsection 2, where not already provided for by existing legislative or other measures, each state party to the present covenant undertakes to take the necessary steps in accordance with its constitutional process. Very direct and very clear. In accordance with its constitutional process and with the provisions of the present covenant to adopt such legislative or other measures as may be necessary to give effect to the rights recognized in the present covenant. In 1948, the nations of the world came together, and they contemplated a documentation that would express the fundamental rights and freedoms of all men and women, of all human beings, that would sign upon this documentation. Now, they used as, if you will, their guideline or their baseline, the Magna Carta and the Cylinder of Cyrus, among other documentations. And through the study of these documentations and through agreement through all these men and women, they came up with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And it was an expression of our fundamental human rights and freedoms, individually. Now, subsequent to that, they came out with what we would call the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights. Now, these covenants included the same operations or the same expressions of law that we found in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. However, now, they were explained in a more detailed way in the International Covenants. Now, Canada is a state party to the International Covenants and to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Freedoms. Canada signed upon these covenants and agreed that whatever human rights and freedoms were expressed in these covenants, that Canada would honor them whether to the individual or honor them whether to the democratic society. Canada said so. Now, when we read in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the other International Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights, we clearly see in Article 2 that it states that the rights and freedoms that are expressed, all the rights and freedoms that are expressed in these international covenants, they must be expressed, they must be allowed to be expressed and operated within the state party Canada through, and they're very specific, through the constitutional process. So we know that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Freedoms and the International Covenants, they express individual freedoms, individual human rights and freedoms, apart from a democratic society. And those expressions of individual human rights and freedoms must find their expression in the constitutional process of a state party, such as Canada, that agreed and signed upon them. So here we're learning that Canada now had a legal obligation. Canada was bound by international law to include all these rights and freedoms in their constitutional process. Now, in 1982, Canada redid their constitution, the Constitution of Canada. Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And in 1982, this obligation to fulfill or to allow the expression of our human rights and freedoms within the constitutional process was fulfilled. They took or they transferred all these rights and freedoms into the Charter of Rights and Freedoms of Canada in 1982. However, they also took all of the freedoms, privileges, benefits, or rights that are included in a democratic society that are also included in these covenants, and they placed it in the Charter also. So now, when you look at the Charter, you have a two-faced Charter. You have a Charter that is in operation, that is going for subjects or players such as the citizen, or that legal person, which is the incorporated person here in Canada. But you also have the Charter that is in operation for the everyone, the human being. The human being whose rights and freedoms were expressed within international law, in the international covenants, now find their expression within the Constitution Act of Canada. So you have a dual situation going on here. You have on one side of the Charter, you have it for a democratic society, and they're limiting rights. On the other side of the Charter, you have it for the human rights and freedoms, human being, men and women, their rights and freedoms apart from anything that's incorporated, apart from a democratic society, and those rights flowing from the Cylinder of Cyrus, the Magna Carta, into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, into the international covenants, and secured and protected through our constitutional process of 1982. The fundamental rights and freedoms that came out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Freedoms were transferred subsequently into the international covenants, and then these rights and freedoms that were granted or expressed or recognized were now transferred into the Charter of Rights and Freedoms 1982, because there was an obligation upon Canada to do so, according to the International Covenant itself, Article 2. Now, the Charter of 1982 does indeed express fundamental rights and freedoms, on one hand, because of the obligation that they had, but it also expresses the corporate or body, or the democratic society, laws or rights and freedoms that will be fundamentally stripped from you and returned to you in a limited fashion, because they state that it's for the best of the democratic society. So the Charter does indeed include human rights and freedoms, and this obligation was upon Canada because they were a signatory to the international covenants and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So when we look to the Charter, it's not a surprise that we should find our human rights and fundamental freedoms contained therein. Now, what are some of the fundamental human rights and freedoms that were agreed upon here internationally that we find transferred into the Charter? The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, 1982. Article 2. Everyone has the following fundamental freedoms: freedom of conscience and religion, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press and other media of communication, freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of association. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 18. Everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right shall include freedom to have or to adopt a religion or belief of his choice, and freedom either individually or in a community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in worship. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 19. Everyone shall have the right to hold opinions without interference. Everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art, or through any other media of his choice. The exercise of the rights provided for in paragraph 2 of this article carries with it the duties, whatever. As you saw, the rights and freedoms that are expressed in the international covenants are coming out or are finding their expression within the Charter of Rights and Freedoms of Canada. Because why? This was the obligation. They had no choice. So the rights and freedoms in the international covenants come out in the Charter. Now we know that the Charter applies to the Government of Canada. As I stated in the opening of this video, Section 32, it says this Charter applies to the Government of Canada, the Parliament and such and such. It doesn't say only, it says but the Charter does apply to them. So that means that the fundamental rights and freedoms that are found within the Charter, Canada as a government has to respect them. They have to respect them because there was an obligation to respect these Charter rights, and it was placed upon Canada through the International Covenant. International Covenant said if you become a signatory to this covenant, then these rights and freedoms that are expressed therein have to become expressed through your constitutional process. So our individual human rights and freedoms are freedoms as men and women apart from a democratic society that were contained in the international covenants and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights come out within the Charter. And the government has to follow this and is obligated to follow this. Now, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, a lot of people like to add the word only. This Charter only applies to the government. And they say, you see, it has nothing to do with me. I don't have to bother with it. I don't have to claim anything from it, and that's it. That's a misconception, a misconceived mind that doesn't understand what's really transpiring. And I'm not here to attack anybody. I'm just here to share what I see transpiring. Because if you invoke your individual rights and freedoms as that one man or one woman, which are protected through the Charter, then Canada has the obligation, because this Charter applies to them. So when we look in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and it states that everyone has the right to recognition as a person before the law, but not an obligation, well, this expression has to come out through the constitutional process or other measures. So when you invoke that fundamental individual human right, that fundamental right as a man or a woman to say, listen, I am not going to be the subject and servant of anyone. I'm not going to take or enter into recognition as that person, as that corporate entity in law, and I'm going to stand with my fundamental human rights and freedoms. Well, Canada, again, has an obligation to respect these rights and freedoms that you are claiming now. So it's very important not to get misconceived here or misunderstood here by saying that, listen, the Charter doesn't apply to me. It only applies to the Government of Canada. Not at all. The Charter applies to each and every individual here in Canada, whether in or without a political body, because that Charter is an expression of the international law, which is an expression of our individual human rights and fundamental freedoms, which are ever present with us apart from any commercial system that could have been built. And by going through the Charter and recognizing what it really is for us, and that it's still working on our behalf as individual men and women, then we can hold the Government of Canada accountable. When you start to understand the operation that's going on between the Charter, the international laws, and the legislation of Canada. But it's really important not to get deceived by those that are going around and saying, listen, you don't have to worry about the Charter, it only applies to the government. You will see that they are adding that word only, because it helps their doctrine of understanding, their doctrine of belief to stand. If they remove that word only and say, okay, the Charter applies to the government, but who else does it apply to? Let's see. We know that it applies to the corporate body. We know that it applies to the citizen. We know that it applies to the legal person. But there are supposed to be fundamental human rights and freedoms, the rights of men and women that were included in the Magna Carta, that were included in the Cylinder of Silence, that were passed down through the generations. These rights and freedoms are also supposed to be included in the Charter. And myself, as one individual, once I understand this, can stand on those Charter rights to say, listen, these are my fundamental human rights and freedoms that were expressed, that are there for me to claim, and you don't have any right to take them away from me and force me to bow my knee to be a subject or a servant to this commercial system, to Her Majesty, or to be an incorporated person with my local municipality. I'm invoking my fundamental human rights and freedoms that are there, that are Charter protected, and that's how I want to stand under. And that's your right. And that's how international law is supposed to work. However, it's unprofitable for those who are running this government.